Sometimes designs are just so good they pop up over and over again. And I'm not just talking about the revolving door of relevancy that is kitten heels and red lipstick. I'm talking about designs whose building blocks can be found hundreds and sometimes even thousands of years in the past. What is it about these ideas that gives them immortality in a field which thrives on novelty?
The arts and crafts period of the late 19th, early 20th centuries is one of my favorite periods of art history, and that's mainly because of the hard swing away from mainstream industrial uniformity in favor of handcraft and individuality, and historicism. The period was all about looking backwards to a simpler time when people, not machines, made things with more innate meaning. So it makes a lot of sense that they were looking back for style influence as well. If this sounds familiar, then yes, basically my entire philosophy. I recently found this on Pinterest. It is a dress from the Cincinnati Art Museum, and I think there is a very direct thread of influence that can easily be traced back to the Renaissance, with some regional European influence as well. I believe we can safely say that we're in the middle of a similar craft movement at the moment, so I will be drawing this thread into my own work. I'm starting with this pattern, which is from the late 1970s. Making this project 2023 does 1906, does 16th century by way of the 1970s. The pattern consists of 2 front panels, side panels, and back panels with a strap that maybe fastens around the back of the neck like a halter, maybe. A waist tie and pockets. I'll be making a lot of changes as I go, so don't get too attached to any of those details.
I usually begin by tracing off the vintage pattern onto pattern paper, but this pattern was already cut, so I used the vintage paper pattern to trace the body shapes onto my fabric. I used a deep red linen that had a homespun look to it. I will be creating a contrast pocket bag, so I folded the pocket piece of the center body panel inwards. Hint from future wiser Jess, if you do this, add seam allowance to the edge. I cut the contrast pocket piece from this black and cream gingham fabric. I seamed the pocket to the accompanying body panel. It was a little off because I didn't add seam allowance, but the whole pattern was a little too big, and as a result I used 3/4 inch seam allowances, so the difference was a wash within the seam allowance. As proof that I take lessons from each project I do, I bound the long body edges of each fabric panel before seaming them together, except for the edges with the pocket. I lined up the pocketed body panels, right sides together, and sewed from the top edge around the pocket and to the hem. I bound the pocket bag separately, then the raw edges on either side so that they covered the raw edge of the pocket bag binding, with a black binding because I ran out of cream binding and was too lazy to make more. I sewed the remaining body panels together, then sewed the 2 halves of the pinafore together down center front.
So I think that it's really helpful when creators share the things that didn't work in a project and share their struggles and challenges and so forth. But I have never yet seen a creator share the mid-project existential crisis, which is odd because it happens every single project right around this time. I love the color story of this dress. The Renaissance loved a good band around the style lines of a look. Often these were actually functional because they concealed structures called guards that helped keep the edges and lines of the garment straight. And they're always a contrasting color like black or cream or a contrasting trim or something. I love that this has the same thing going on, but it's a different shade of red. Actually, this is velvet, and this may just be embroidery, meaning it's like a matte shine situation. I want to do something similar, so I changed the shape of the top portion of the garment to make the lines straight, and I changed the shape of the straps to a point. I got all these different shades of red bias binding from the craft store. I mean, who knew there were so many? And I want to use one of them to create bands around part of the top. I'm thinking maybe the bright red. I think that's a little bit less expected than the darker shade. Maybe this red that almost matches. We'll see. And here's my big design crisis. I feel a lot of pressure as a modern fashion designer coming from the modern fashion design world to be avant-garde and novel and to do something outside the box and subversive and whatever. But I think that the whole point of this channel and a lot of these projects that I do is really just like deconstructing the codes of historicism and trying to figure out what it is about these styles that keeps us coming back for more, you know? Like, I want to know, like, what makes these styles so emotionally durable. So I think that the main reason that I have an emotional response to the arts and crafts piece is because I can look at it and see the Renaissance influence. I need to get out of the way of this project and to let it be what it needs to be.
On a slightly less pretentious note, let's talk about the fabric. It was made from coarse warps and wefts with a lot of slub in them. The weave was loose, not like cheesecloth or anything, but still warbly. Maybe this fabric was better suited to curtains, but I think I pulled it off. Barely. Anywho, there is no sewing a straight line with this stuff. Definitely no cutting a straight line. So to give my straps the best shot at least looking straight, I pulled a warp and cut along the voided line. I cut a strap and bib lining from the contrast gingham, about 1/8 inch smaller than the self fabric. I placed the lining against the self, right sides together, and sewed each side as though they were the same size. This took some ease witchery. The result was a strap that sort of looks like a tunnel. When pressed, this allowed the self fabric to create a lip so that the contrast lining wasn't seen from the right side. Here's an early version without this done. Also, this is why I didn't use the bright red binding. It looked like ketchup. I cut the binding so that it was 1/2 inch with a folded seam allowance to each side. I placed the binding 1/8 inch to the inside of the edge of the strap and stitched it down using a very fine fell stitch that only caught a single thread of the binding. I folded it around the angles and stitched the folds in place. Not perfect, but eh. If you didn't catch it, there were quite a few extra steps and unnecessary hand stitching in there, but I think they were worth it, if only to keep in the spirit of the arts and crafts movement. I sewed the new bib piece to the top of the body, right sides together. I placed the gingham lining against the bib linen, right sides together, and sewed the two side edges, but not the top. I sandwiched the straps between the linen and the lining of the bib, with the right side of the strap facing the right side of the bib and the strap upside down. I sewed the top edge of the bib through all layers. I turned this right side out and pressed. The upper edge of the side of the pinafore gets a facing, which I cut from the gingham. I sewed the facing pieces together at the side seams, with red thread because I'm too lazy to switch out my thread color apparently. Then I realized I needed to bind the bottom edge of the facing, and I was out of black binding, so all of my laziness was for naught as I both made new cream binding and changed the thread in my machine. I placed the bound facing right sides together against the accompanying linen edge and sewed. I pressed the facing to the inside of the dress and pressed the seam allowance of the bottom of the bib to the inside. I fell stitched all of this in place, being extremely careful to only catch a single thread from the linen. My deep, contrasting hem facing moment came in gingham for this project. I stitched the hem facing pieces together at the side seams, bound the raw edge in cream bias binding, and placed it along the hem of the pinafore right sides together. I sewed along the hem edge and flipped the facing to the inside. I pressed a tiny lip of linen to the inside and prick stitched the very edge to keep things crisp. As crisp as possible with this linen. I fell stitched along the binding of the facing, again only catching a single thread of the linen fabric. I could have done another gingham facing along the back edges of the pinafore, but since I had already bound the edge, I just flipped it to the inside and fell stitched it down. Now I had my second existential design crisis over the layout of the bib banding. I ended up placing one piece along the long upper edge. I stitched another piece 3/8 inch below the top band to echo the banding of the strap. I thought of the banding similarly to how I thought of the top stitching of the last project. Easy to go overboard, and modernity is in the editing.
Okay, I really do not get the strap attachment halter thingy. It's not super clear either in this technical drawing or in the instructions how this thing works. I guess they button together? I can't really picture that being an elegant looking junction. Something I wish I'd realized like 10 steps ago. I think instead I'm going to attach a strap to the back of the skirt to make this like a true strap. We'll see what happens.
I cut another 2 straps from the linen and gingham, sans the point, sewed them, and pressed. I seam ripped the top edge of the skirt at the center side seam, placed the new strap into the resulting hole, and essentially hand-stitched in the banding ditch to secure the strap. I fell-stitched the lining to close the hole and called it a day because I was over it. I folded the seam allowance to the inside and whip-stitched the top of the strap closed. Here's a fun tip if you want a fabric-covered button but don't have one of those handy fabric-covered button kits. Take a plain button, helps if it's domed, and cut out a circle of fabric about twice the size of the button, running stitch about 1/8 inch inside the perimeter of the circle. Place the button inside and pull the stitching tight to enclose the button. Tie off the thread tails of the stitching to secure the gathering. Obviously, this is the first knot I ever tied in my life. I brought the needle and thread back through the gathers and tied a few more knots just to make sure everything was secure. I've done a lot of buttons this way, but this fabric is pretty prone to fraying, so we'll see how it holds up over time. I made a machine buttonhole at the apex of the strap point. I regret this because, let's face it, I will never put this pinafore on and then button it. I will always just slip the already buttoned straps over my head. So I definitely could have just sewn the button to the strap as a faux button closure. Oh well. I sewed together 2 of the bias strips I cut from the binding to create the waist ties. I flipped them right side out and ironed. These were not pretty and much thinner than I'd have liked, but I was still in a surly mood from the strap. I secured the strap right side to the inside of the skirt edge of the pinafore with some very ugly stitching. Turned it to the outside and did some more ugly stitching that was thankfully not visible from the right side. I then made another buttonhole along the center side seam for the tie to pass through. While I can definitely make a list of the exact details that carry over from era to era, or maybe more poignantly, which details evoke an emotional response within each design, I don't know if I can really say what makes these styles so persistent. Perhaps it is as simple and imperfect as a romantic sense of nostalgia. The geometry of a border that frames the face, or the warmth and comfort of red. I do know this is only the beginning of my exploration of the arts and crafts movement, although I'm currently very excited about exploring historicism through a slightly different lens in my next project. If you enjoyed this video, I always appreciate a thumbs up. And hit subscribe if you find yourself looking to the past for style inspiration. As I mentioned, I'm embarking on a rather large project, so look for those videos to begin popping up shortly. Bye!